This workshop presentation by Dr. Miguel Gomez and Mr. Benjamin Mueller was part of the MEAS-supported research project entitled Examining Privately Led Extension Approaches Targeting Smallholder Farmers in Developing Countries. The workshop was held on June 2, 2015 in Washington, D.C., and preceded the three-day Modernizing Extension and Advisory Services Symposium that took place June 3rd through 5th, 2015. Innovators from private sector NGOs and companies who provide extension activities to smallholder farmers around the world participated in the day-long event. 43 representatives from non-governmental organizations, public institutions, private sector companies, and donor organizations presented and discussed a range of topics, which included research and knowledge transfer, technology adoption, value chain markets, as well as the key features and characteristics of sustainable extension and advisory services, EAS models, in developing countries, including those poorest nations targeted in the U.S. government Feed the Future global initiative. Dr. Gomez of Cornell University and Mr. Mueller from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign shared their research methods and preliminary results of a quantitative and qualitative investigation of privately led extension approaches that target smallholder farmers in developing countries.
So these are the critical questions we addressed in the study. Can the private sector activities reduce poverty and food security and improve conditions for small farmers? I think our study it's not unique, but I think it is somewhat unique in that we really are focused on the smallholder farmers. We really are focusing on the organizations that are working with these. And so I think it's important to get that context. There's been some, Dr. Babu has done some very, very good work, and I look forward to seeing the book on the case studies, but this is, again, an approach where we're looking at over 100 organizations and trying to glean some trends from those surveys that were filled out. Then how are these new arrangements for involving private sector, how is that influencing the provision of information and advisory services? In other words, we know that some new systems, some new approaches, but how is that really influencing and changing the EAS model? And then finally, I think the big question is how might these partnerships, these public-private partnerships, these civil service society actors, the private sector, what's the equilibrium between a true partnership and a kind of duplicity of efforts and some competitiveness? In other words, how do we find the right arrangement so that these partnerships actually flourish and help us to develop? I think that's not an easy question and not a one-size-fits-all question, but it's a very important question for us to continue to explore today. This is the basic methodology. This was a survey that we distributed. It was quite detailed. Some of those that have filled out the survey have not complained, but mentioned that it took quite a bit of time to go through it. We appreciate the patience of those that did that. We've also heard, though, on the other side that the survey instrument itself was illustrative of issues in the organization that should perhaps be thought about more. So we do think that the survey served as a good data collection tool, but also a bit of a learning tool to help organizations think about all the areas that they might be considering.
The preliminary results will follow basically this order of points 1 to 6. And again, these are selected very preliminary findings because in our project with MEAS USAID, part of our input for the project is what we learned from this forum, but we think this quantification helps us as well. So I'm going to share with you some of the results. And first to share with you some of the organizational characteristics that we find out there in our sample. Remember, these are 78 organizations working in all 3 continents. So we find that about 50% are private businesses, and about 37% of in our sample organizations were NGOs, non-for-profit organizations, but we also have representations that are very important to extensions such as FBOs, farm-based organizations, social enterprises, and even research institutions, mostly the CGR centers and other types. So to give you an idea of where we are, we see that we have an overrepresentation of Africa in our institutions working in Africa, well, because there is a lot of interest and emphasis on Africa, but we also have a wide arrangement of different organizations in all 3 main continents of focus. Okay? So in terms of the role in the value chain of these organizations, we ask, what's your main role? Basically, 13% were what we call upstream companies. That's suppliers to farmers, like fertilizer companies, input machinery, and agrochemical companies. Downstream were closer to consumer buyers. Those that buy farm products are 21%. About a third of our organizations work in both in areas as suppliers to farmers, but also buyers, and 36% are support organizations, providers of other services such as marketing, infrastructure, information, etc. Financing, in particular, was very important there. And we see also that we have representation of the different types in the region. The partnership arrangements, we found that about 70% of our sample were part of a PPP. Only 30% were not part of a PPP, were completely a private initiative. And again, we see yes and no's in our sample. In terms of institutional arrangements for implementation, we are using these Venn diagrams because we think this shows the complexity and diversity, the pluralism of arrangements that we see out there. Yeah? So we see, for example, that 20 of our respondents were just arrangement that was for implementation. We are talking about implementation. Was the 20 organizations with private sector for profit was in charge 100% of implementation. And then we have all sorts of different arrangements, just FBOs, just NGOs, NGOs in collaboration with private sector, and we only find public and private implementation strategies in the intersection between the red diagram and the yellow diagram, which tend to be small. So we found from these, we found no example of shared public-private implementation without an NGO or a farm-based organization involvement. We find a high representation of private-only implementation strategies, and see in general, as these diagrams show, a high heterogeneity in terms of implementation strategies in our sample. So when we think about funding, on the other hand, what are the institutional arrangements for funding? We see more public-private collaboration in funding compared to implementation. So we see here all sorts of types of funding arrangements ranging from just FBOs or just private or just NGOs to situations in which you have the public, the FBO, and the private sector collaborating. So we see all these arrangements. We also highlight here that about half of partnerships in our sample are completely funded by the private sector. So just to give you an idea of the reach of the organizations that we interview in our samples, we have about these 78 organizations are targeting more than 1.5 million smallholders in Africa, more than 1 million in Latin America, and a little bit over 500,000 in Asia, for a total of over 3 million farmers households. Okay, so share with you a little bit about, in terms of extension activities, we wanted to know what are the extension objectives? What is the prevalence of the different objectives? And we selected the most important objectives. And here we can see several things. First, we see the first by far is increasing productivity and improve quality life for farmers, promote technology adoption and increase product quality. Of the top 4, 3 of them are focusing on farm level increased productivity, product quality. They are product oriented, okay? Then we have increased market access to farmers, reliable supply, ensure reliable supply of agricultural products, reduce poverty. And we have about, in the top here, about more than 40% working targeting marginalized groups in particular. Little bit less than 40% engage has as a clear objective to promote climate change adoption. So the message from this graph is that organizations appear to have multiple objectives. Not only 1 or 2 objectives. Most of our organizations tend to have between 9 and 11 of these objectives that involve a combination of improving productivity, reducing poverty, improving livelihoods, preserving the environment, targeting marginalized groups, etc. So we don't find specialization here. And that's a big question that we have, that we are going to explore more. Is this diversification in objectives a plus? What are the advantages? What are some of the disadvantages of that? Because as economists, we tend to think that specialization tends to be good. So the prevalence of extension approaches, which is a little bit different, one is the objectives, and this was interesting because we see that the winners here are basically technical assistance, value chain development, business development there. We see less importance in terms of the prevalence of the provision of financial services and environmental and natural resource management. And I mention this because it's interesting, because the provision of the final services, and I'm going to show later, is associated with some of the best outcomes that we have. Yeah? We see again a high emphasis on productivity, production, farm level, becoming a more productive unit, with very important component today of business development, more important than education and community development, which we can see there. So we ask also, what is the importance of these extension approaches? Again, this is the most important by far, from 0 to 4 is technical assistance. It's very important today, and we can say that it is almost twice as important as other extension approaches focusing in things like financial services, education, community development, etc. And we see always kind of environmental and natural resource management in the bottom, always. In the responses. So when we talk about tactics, these are ways to implement where we had a long list of potential tactics, from demonstration plots to train lead farmers, to provision of financial services, to encourage farmers to buyer networking or farmer-to-farmer networking, etc. All this, we find exactly something very similar to the objectives, that the organizations that we talk to use they have a wide toolkit to deliver extension services. But again, the most important ones we have to highlight, more than 70% demonstration plots and training lead farmers were the most prevalent, followed then by training related to provision of inputs, linking farmers to markets, and strengthening producer groups there. Interestingly, contract farming, when we talk to economists, they argue that contract farming is the key. Some of our colleagues in economics, it tends to be not very common as we see today in this sample. Again, in terms of extension activities, we find that about half of our organizations in our sample use 9 or more tactics, and this begs the question as to, what are the advantages and maybe disadvantages of this approach? Now, in extension activity, we want to talk about the vehicles through which we deliver extension information knowledge, and printed handouts is prevalent in 80% of the cases. Mobile phones, I'm sorry, we forgot the I there. Mobile phones like texting and apps are very important, as this morning in the panel it was mentioned. More than 60% of our respondents say that they use mobile phones to deliver extension services, extension information. Then radio is a little bit over 40%, and then you can see from there down. So when it comes to the evaluation, we also ask them to evaluate what the progress has been made in the different objectives that these organizations have. What progress do they have in terms of objectives? And we ask also about the type of formal, informal evaluation process. And was interesting for us that we found that, that about 3/4 of the organizations have some form of formal evaluation process. Only 21% have only informal evaluation processes. We were in our interviews, the respondents were very concerned about how to evaluate performance, and the difficulties of measuring performance was evident in our interviews. So for formal evaluation, we see that about half do it internally, half do it externally and internally. So there is always an internal evaluation, and only about half of our sample have really external independent evaluation of performance. So it was interesting also that almost more than 90% of our respondents say that they get feedback from farmers. And here are some of the self-evaluation in outcomes from 1, very low, to 5, very high, how these organizations see that they are making progress towards the goal. Again, we see that the top, they feel that they are making more progress in things that have to do with production, increased productivity, reliable supply of agricultural products, increased product quality. These are things that are product-oriented. Then we see less success as they see themselves in terms of poverty reduction, improvements of livelihoods of marginalized groups, and even improve quality of life. And definitely in the top, In the bottom of this graph, you see the improved environmental management, where progress has been mediocre, below 3. So we see this. So, and there are some very interesting differences across regions here. We look at the same scores of performance in the 3 continents, and we see that in general, our respondents from Asia and the Pacific felt that they were making more progress towards goals than their African or Latin American and Caribbean counterparts in our sample. Okay? So we also did some very preliminary associations, and these are associations, this is not causality, between the performance in specific outcomes and the extension tactics that they use. Yeah? So see, these are based on some very simple initial econometric models. So we see that increased productivity is in general associated with very, very high with the tactics that involve the provision of financial services. ++ means that it's very strong, the association, and with the tactics that involve farmer to buyer networking. Improve product quality, again, financial services played very strong association here, and farmer to farmer networking, again, very strong. Farmer to buyer is key here, but also here, business development tactics and information and communication technologies appear to have very good association with this type of outcomes. Increased market access, again, financial services play a key role there, and strengthen producer groups, promoting cooperativism was very, very important there, aggregation. Interestingly, we have no one single tactic associated with improvement in livelihoods of farmers. We have run several models. These are preliminary results, but they are interesting. Alleviation of poverty, the only one that we found is when those organizations that use farmer field schools improve environmental management, basically associated better scores with use of demonstration plots and farm field schools and build management capacity with the lead farmer approach. So these are some things that are just exploration of the data, but we start to see some patterns of certain tactics that are associated with better incomes. We don't know what the causality is in this case, but there is the association there.
When we ask about their mission and their program goals, these are some of the common elements that we came up with. There's really no surprises here, but beyond what we would normally, the quantitative data shows this emphasis on productivity and technical assistance, the market access issues. We see then these other areas coming in, at least in the mission and goals. They may not be accomplishing this yet in ways that are, from their own evaluation, significant and impactful, but they are definitely looking at these issues of social objectives such as the health and the food nutrition, safety, preventing child labor. So it's definitely on the radar screen, and they're working on those issues. We've talked a bit about the environmental issues as well, and they probably are moving towards measurable impacts, but they have this again as part of their mission and goals. And not surprisingly, the collaboration is a big issue. They recognize the need for organizational development of cooperatives. They need to have these partnerships with the public and the private sector. So again, we ask about keys to success. Again, I'm a big fan of this, so maybe a bit of my coding reflects some bias, but I do think that this idea of trust building, the building of social capital, these relationships with farmers, I mean, we see this wherever you go. The farmers have to believe that what they're getting from the extension is something that's going to help them. They got to trust them. There's a lot of issues that are coming out that are dramatic changes. New pests are coming in overnight. Climate changes are happening. There's a lot of information out there that needs to be digested and advice given, and you have to have that relationship for trust. Otherwise, there's not going to be as much adaptation to the advice that's given and use of it. I think that this is important. I think transparency is important. The idea of participation is extremely important to have an effective model. That's what the people are saying in our study. Other keys that are not as prevalent but seem to be very important, of course, and you would expect this, that the technical assistance is embedded in the supply chain, so it's responsive to the growth of that chain. These nodes of connection, these communication channels are extremely important. You have to rely on a good variety of them and those that are most appropriate to the region. We talked again about this in the earlier panel. A single cash crop is really not as much the emphasis, although it's very important, but we need to have kind of this holistic farm management approach and the opportunities for diversified production. You know, even the smallest farmer, if it's possible, needs a cash crop. It's just one of those realities that we try to, that I think these organizations are talking about. Integrated extension activities that address the challenges. This is again what we're seeing, that so many organizations have multiple facets to their approach. And then, you know, the how they're doing some evaluation. I think there's an extreme interest in learning more about evaluation. We see, you know, as Miguel has pointed out, more and more organizations that are including in their package of service financial assistance, financial ability to get loans, ability to jumpstart their production with some resources. So I think that continues to be an issue, but it's being addressed. We want to continue, I think they want to continue to look at extension activities that provide information and, you know, this market intelligence about the needs of small farmers to private suppliers. And the opportunities, I think, are definitely there with the modern communication technologies, the processing, the post-harvest handling, the value-added products, and again, the better metrics and tracking. But I do think the point that Miguel made earlier about this public-private partnership, a lot of cases, at least in the preliminary data that we've collected, you see that there is this partnership in the sense that the public sector or a donor organization is providing the funding, but the partnership doesn't continue as richly as it could in the actual implementation. So this becomes, you know, certainly organizations need the resources, and where they can find them, they will use them, and they will work under the terms of reference of the funder. But I think it's probably another takeaway that if we could become more cooperative and collaborative in building beyond just a funding role to actually be more active in the partnership, particularly with public sector organization ministries, I think that'll make the thing more functional and productive. Again, we've mentioned this previously, but it is, I think, a good takeaway is that we're seeing more progress related to farm-level goals related to production and marketing. That's not surprising. There's still the emphasis there, but that's how these organizations see themselves, and that's where, when they do their self-assessment, that's where they're making more progress. They're making less progress on some of the tougher social goals of poverty reduction, improved quality of life, and those are more difficult, but they are tackling them. So there's less progress with those social goals and less progress with the environmental goals as well. But they are, they're part of their agenda. As Miguel mentioned, there seems to be more progress in regions of the world, more in Asia and the Pacific than in Africa and Latin America, which probably is very understandable considering the conditions, but nevertheless, that's something that came out. The extension tactics, it does seem that that financial services are really important to advance the goals. If there's not financial services there can be excellent training, there can be excellent professional development, but in the end, those services need to be available in order to be able to put into play the training and development, the capacity building. So the financial services are very important. And there's just a crossover in all of the open-ended responses of talking about how important the participatory approaches are. But when we try to look at some of the other data, it's still difficult to measure that impact on outcomes. But it's definitely something that these organizations see as important. It's just I don't think they've quite figured out yet how to measure and monitor the effectiveness of this approach.